Hello, everybody, and welcome to our policy class. I'm Professor Andy Molnar and happy to be with you. This is an essential class, right? A lot of people see policy as something on the wall or paperwork. No. It leads to good controls, tools, people, and processes, which is something we'll talk about later in governance. Now, I hope you had a chance to review the overview slides that I presented just prior to Chapter 1 in Week 1. Those give you a lot of the policy. So the book is actually kind of, these first few chapters are about how to create the policy, right? But already I want us to be thinking about what policy with this paperwork am I actually trying to create. And that's why I start out now. So after hopefully you reviewed the overview slides, you made some notes, because that's a lot of the policy and policy types, management controls, and other types of controls, administrative controls, right? To least privilege. So those are some of the, between policy and standards and procedures and guidelines, all of which we'll talk about definitions during this course, right? Those nuggets are there in the overview and in these few slides in Chapter 1, and I'll include them in other lessons too, like when we get to access management, right? I'll go over some access management policy. So let's begin this part of the conversation, which is the first. I do 12 principles, which are from another author, right? But I think they're just solid gold. And these are the principles of cybersecurity that drive policy. Remember, for any company that you work in, any major company, I would expect that they only have about 20 to 25 policies max, right? Policies are high level, they're general, but they guide then the standards that we will implement, which will lead to controls. So these 12 principles are really tied to this course because they are the general areas that we want to consider for good policy. Okay? So go through them with me with that background in mind. So I start off with a balance. Anytime we do policy, we want to balance security and the business needs. Remember, security is here to enhance the business, to support the business. Sometimes we get into trouble when a security professional is a purist and demands that a business do X, Y, or Z. Well, you do want to stand up for principle and if it's the right thing to do, right? So I'm not telling you not to. I'm saying be cautious because we implement security based on providing business value. So there's an enormous misconception that security means turning everything off and locking everything up, right? And so the problem is that when you do that, your data, your devices, your systems become unusable, right? So security is not synonymous with difficulty, and usability does not necessarily mean insecure. You can have good security and usability. In fact, this is something we should strive for, right? We want to deliver on the expectation of a good user experience. And we get to this balance by applying CIA, okay, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Now, this is kind of an overview then of those principles to consider in policy. So an organization's security postures defines its tolerance for risk and outlines how the organization plans to protect the information and the resources that you are responsible for. So this posture is documented in standards and guidelines, as I mentioned, and procedures, which all come from policy that must exist long before a single program is written or a computer is installed. So these would be some of your considerations. Now, principle 1 is here on this slide. So the SolarWinds attack that was revealed in December of this past year, December of 2020, is an example of that. We're talking an operation that was probably at least 2 years in the making, if not more, right? But we were unaware. The attackers were patient. When they get into an environment, they're going to make potential mistakes, but know that time favors the attacker. When they're ghosts in a show and they're not detected. So once they're detected, the time favors the defender, of course, and things transition because because now we're on to them, but still we're chasing them. And the SolarWinds attackers were very good at erasing their tracks, erasing logs, for example, right? Log entries, which in fact is another approach to security separate from policy. But nowadays, to find when you were hacked or the approach, you almost want to look for gaps in logs as people work to erase them. So anyhow, once they're detected, time favors the defender, as I mentioned. And that's what we're seeing now. You're seeing trickling in reports on Sunburst still coming out every week, right? And so the attacker's on the retreat. But what the attacker will do, we'll want to be careful with, is they will take that knowledge and go to another company, right? So there's no absolute security. Just going back to this slide, even the integration between vendors. So we talk about policy. What about vendor integration, right? Vendors are a source of security risk, and that's also what Sunburst revealed to us. Now, I mentioned CIA, so we're talking about security, and the CIA Triad is one of the most important models, which is designed to guide policies for information security within an organization. Stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Notice here on the slide that CIA addresses IAAA, right? The multiple A's: identification, authorization, which includes then access, in my mind, or identification, I meant authentication, then authorization, which also is known as access, audit, and accounting. These features are supported by applying a CIA in your organization. So here's an example of confidentiality. Means that only the authorized individuals or systems can view sensitive or classified information, or frankly any information. Confidentiality, like using encryption, for example, is a way to do confidentiality. Confidentiality is the approach. The data being sent over the network should not be accessed by unauthorized individuals, is what we're saying, right? So the attacker may try to capture the data using different tools available on the internet and gain access to your information. And the primary way to avoid that is implementing the concept of confidentiality using encryption techniques to safeguard your data, so that even if the hacker gains access to the data, they won't be able to decrypt it. So encryption standards include AES, that's Advanced Encryption Standard, and DES, for example, Data Encryption Standard. Another way to protect your data is a VPN tunnel from an insecure network onto your own corporate network, where it meets the VPN concentrator in the DMZ, etc. So that's a way to apply confidentiality. Now, integrity piece of it is next. And this is the idea here that we're making sure the data has not been modified, right? Corruption of the data is a failure to maintain integrity. So any policy and standards we apply and procedures should address not only confidentiality, but integrity and availability, right? To keep, in this case, integrity, to keep the data from being corrupted, right? To check that if our data has been modified or not, we can use a hash function. And there are a couple of kinds of hash functions. One is SHA, Secure Hash Algorithm, and the other is MD5, or Message Digest 5. And And so this is known generally, whether you use SHA or Message Digest 5, as a message digest when you hash, right? MD5 is 128-bit hash. SHA is 160-bit hash. Many then moved to SHA-1, and I think now we're on SHA-2 or 3. So it continues to get stronger all the time. So let's assume host A wants to send data to host B and maintain integrity, right? The hash function will run over the data and produce an arbitrary hash value, which is then attached to the data. When host B receives the packet, it runs the same hash function over the data, which gives a hash value 2. Now, if hash value 1 and hash value 2 are the same, they equal each other, this means that the data's integrity has been maintained and that the contents were not modified, which is what the picture is showing. Now, the last part, which is availability, means that the network should be readily available to its users. The data is always accessible when I need it. So this applies to the systems and the data. So to ensure availability, the network administrator should maintain the hardware, make regular upgrades, have a plan for failover if a server fails. If it's a critical server, it will fail over to the next one and the user doesn't notice the difference. This will prevent a bottleneck in the network. Attacks such as denial of service or DDoS render a network unavailable as the resources of the network get exhausted. So DDoS, or DOS even, is an attack against availability. So the impact can be significant, and users who rely on the network as a business tool, for example, will be harmed. So proper measures should be taken. So here's kind of a one-slide summary of CIA, some additional notes that you would apply when doing good policy. Now, principle 4 is defense, principle 3 rather is defense in depth. This is an approach to cybersecurity in which a series of defensive mechanisms are layered in order to protect valuable data and information, right? When I'm looking at gaps or risk assessments, I have my technologists adjudicate or resolve requirements, and if they can't, I ask them what are their compensating controls. That's part of that defense in depth. So if one mechanism fails, I mentioned for DDoS, another steps in to immediately thwart the attack or to continue this service, right? That would be applying a defense in depth strategy. This is this multi-layered approach with intentional redundancies that increases the security of a system as a whole and addresses many different attack vectors. So defense in depth is commonly referred to as the castle approach because it mirrors the layered defenses of a medieval castle, for example. So before we can penetrate a castle, you are faced with the moat, the ramparts, the drawbridge, the towers, battlements, and so on, right? And the digital world has revolutionized to how we live, work, and play. So this sort of approach, the digital world is constantly open to attack as we add new features, the Internet of Things, for example, embedded systems and operating systems, that sort of thing. So because there's so many potential attackers and now so many attack approaches or vectors, we need to ensure that we have the right security in place. Unfortunately, there's no one single method that can successfully prevent all attacks. We will take a short break and come back with Principle 4 and finish out through Principle 12 and then discuss Chapter 1. See you in a little bit.